This is Sleeping in Trees, the audiobook. Chapter 6 of Catapults and Slingshots. At about age 10, Lobster and I discovered the slingshot, a magnificent, small handheld catapult of sorts that could fire any number of projectiles at high velocity. Since the Middle Ages or before, people have been trying to figure out how to maim, kill, or otherwise gain the attention of other people by hurling objects at them from afar. From afar is a critical point. The premise is that the closer the assailant is to the assailed, the greater the odds of the assailant also being injured during the fray. Angry mobs and marauding soldiers have, for many millennia, toiled tirelessly to develop contraptions that could hurl away all day a wide array of harmful and deadly objects great distances. The broad class of machines that could fling these lethal projectiles are called catapults. The Latin derivation of catapult means to toss or hurl. They came in many shapes and sizes and went by many names, including ballista, springald, mangonel, onager, trebuchet, and couillard. The catapult really came into its own in the Middle Ages. Castles were popping up all over the place. 12-foot thick stone walls were formidable indeed. So armies bent on conquest needed robust weapons of siege. Sticks and stones just weren't getting it done. The catapult proved to be just the thing. The projectiles were only limited by the marauder's creativity, which was apparently in plentiful supply. Large boulders were a favorite, or heavy chunks of wood. Carcasses of large farm animals would sometimes do. Consider the impact of being struck by a 2,000-pound dead cow hurled at 60 miles per hour. Even the cannonball's early existence owes itself to the catapult. Large iron-tipped arrows came into vogue later in the development cycle. Sometimes the assailants even flung piles of putrid trash. That'll fix 'em. In the early 1990s, an English nobleman of substantial lineage and leisurely lifestyle held a celebration each year around Christmas. A large group of revelers would descend upon his sprawling country estate deep in the Cotswolds, with the singular purpose of drinking copious amounts of champagne, eggnog, and mead, while hurling either a baby grand piano or a Volkswagen Beetle, whichever could be sourced, high into the air a few hundred meters across his empty field. The projectile would land with a thunderous crash which would, in turn, ignite an equally explosive roar of appreciation and glee from the besotted and unruly crowd at the launch site a quarter of a mile away. How festive! The drunken mob used a trebuchet, a catapult of sorts that deployed a large weight, rather than tension, to power the launch of the projectiles. A large wooden A-frame was constructed and secured in the field. Swinging between its widely spread legs was a log just a tad bit shorter than the supporting legs. Ah, male engineers, it's always the same. The propulsion that day came from a massive concrete weight affixed to the low end of the log. A chain was fastened to the tip at the opposite end and then hooked onto the object to be hurled. When this gentleman's farm tractor, earlier hurlers used oxen, pulled on a long cable, the chain end of the launching pole was drawn back, and the heavy weight lifted high in the air. Upon the release of the cable, the weight plunged to the ground with explosive force. Ganked by a few thousand pounds of thrust, the attached article was quickly headed for a high, arcing journey across the picturesque English countryside. Wikipedia says the most famous historical account of trebuchet use dates back to the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, when the army of Edward I constructed a giant trebuchet known as Warwolf, which then proceeded to level a section of wall, successfully concluding the siege. Good job, King Edward. As for the slingshot, not much was happening in its development until Charles Goodyear invented vulcanized rubber in 1839. The connection between the stretchy new material and a small device that could fire projectiles, when a few bands were pulled taut and released, was very slow in coming. For Goodyear's rubber, there were new applications for more promising and profitable markets, including rubber bands and pneumatic tires. The latter would dramatically improve the quality of motoring in an automobile or on a bike. And then there were shoes. Lobster brought home the first slingshot I'd ever seen from Zips Sporting Goods in South Miami. Zips was right next door to Christie's barber shop on Red Road. Mr. Christie and his son ran the place for years. They gave haircuts, but they also had Playboy magazine on a small stand near the rear of the shop. Of all the times I sat and waited for my haircut, no matter how hard I schemed, I was never able to figure out how to get a hold or even a peek inside one of those glossy, forbidden magazines. Mr. Christie and Junior were vigilant in making sure no copy was ever left haphazardly on the magazine stand up front. I was relegated to watching the older men casually flip through the pages, smiling, and even sometimes extending their arms to view the glorious centerfold as it flopped open into their laps. This would typically elicit a stern glance from the senior Christie and an unspoken insistence on viewer discretion. In contrast, Field and Stream magazine was very safe and quite accessible. After all, it was only a magazine dedicated to death, full of high-powered weaponry, and associated training plus strategies designed to hunt down a wide variety of mostly defenseless woodland creatures. One day, while waiting for my turn in the big red leather and chrome chair, I spotted a tiny ad in the back pages promoting all the chemicals a kid needed to build bombs at home. Soon, my colorful and exciting career in pyrotechnics began. Good thing I was never able to get my hands on a Playboy. Lobster and I headed out to the backyard with a new slingshot. Passing the garbage cans, he scooped up a handful of South Florida white gravel for ammo. Neither one of us had ever handled a slingshot. On occasion, we'd seen them used by the street urchins on Spanky and our gang on Saturday morning TV, so we were fairly well schooled in how to handle the apparatus. A few things became quickly apparent. First, do not shoot your thumb. It hurts like hell. It happens when one releases the small loaded leather sling after drawing it back while misaligned. The shooter learns quickly how to not do this. That first day, my thumb throbbed for hours. A bruise followed, and my thumbnail turned an ugly brownish orange and fell off 2 weeks later. The whammo, our first slingshot, was made of a light-colored wood, oak or white pine. It was thickly constructed, perhaps too much so since the size of the Y that the ammo had to pass through was an inch too narrow. After 15 or 20 shots, we found that about a third of them actually hit the side of the Y and ricocheted off, missing the target completely. This left nasty dents in the wood. While we were no longer shooting our thumbs, we were also not shooting anything else, and the slingshot was eating itself alive. It wasn't long before the disappointments in the crummy device had Lobster taking a hammer to it in the driveway. That was one of his more endearing traits. If he didn't approve of or like something, he usually destroyed it. A couple of weeks later, we had coerced Mom into taking us into the Sunset 5 and 10 late one afternoon after school. A 5 and 10 cent store was a crafty approach to suggest one could purchase an array of goods for pennies. They had a big jar of bubble gum and some stale candy at the advertised price point, but little else. Fast forward 50 years, add some insidious inflation, and we now have dollar stores. There was something Mom needed to pick up, and we trailed in after her in hopes of getting lucky. This store had it all, an enormous variety of anything one could want, including candy and toys. While Mom headed down an aisle On our quest for construction paper and Elmer's glue, we headed straight to the toy department. Lobster struck gold with a discovery that would alter our lifestyles for years to come. There, hanging on a long, flimsy cardboard display, were a dozen slingshots like no others we had ever seen. Unlike the clunky and expensive wooden one from Zips, these were made of what looked like heavy coat hanger wire, covered with a vinyl in a rainbow of bright colors. There was a shiny tin clip holding the Y together where one's thumb went. The Y branch was quite wide, unlike the wooden model. This caught our eyes immediately. Two skinny, long rubber bands were looped into each branch end and connected to a thin piece of soft leather that was used like a sling to secure the ammo. It was lightweight and flexible. We were intrigued. Lobster said it was a simple and efficient design. Arms folded, with 3 fingers supporting my chin, I frowned and nodded in a thoughtful concurrence. Then we saw the one thing we dreaded, but always looked for. There it was, a tiny, shiny gold sticker, made in Japan. We were momentarily crestfallen, but quickly recovered when we saw the price. Ah, the price. Only 25 cents? Lobster twisted one from the placard display, pinched the little leather pouch, drew back and released. It made a swishing sound as the bands recoiled and the empty leather pouch shot cleanly through the center of the Y without obstruction. He smiled, and I raised my eyebrows in surprised approval. Made in Japan was a junk label in the 1960s. Following the massive setback of World War II, it took Japan decades to rebuild and then slowly improve their processes, materials, and manufacturing prowess to build products as magnificent as a Lexus sedan, a Honda, and a Sony TV. Heck, even in a burst of creativity, they even invented the compact disc, CD, which morphed before long into the DVD. It was a long journey and a tough slog for the tiny island country. In the early going, the Japanese flooded America and the rest of the free world with cheap, low-quality products in relentless wave after wave. Hardly endearing themselves to the American consumer, it was no surprise that, for many years, they carried a low-quality stigma. Just like the Korea and China label would decades later as they began their own emergence, the J in Japan stood for junk. At 25 cents a piece, we convinced Mom to splurge and buy 2. Lobster and I raced out of the Sunset 5 and 10, ready for action. We fiddled and fidgeted with them all the way home, aching for any ammo to test them out. Alas, nothing laying loose around in the car would work. Lobster discovered that if one placed the empty slingshot against a younger brother's bare leg, drew back the leather sling and released, it stung the younger brother like heck and left a red welt. We were optimistic based on the dry run in the toy aisle, but loaded with a piece of gravel and drawn back fully, we were both astounded by the incredible power and accuracy of these cheap little slingshots. The hibiscus flower, 20 paces away, exploded with Lobster's first shot. We were stunned and wore huge grins. I loaded up and took aim. Pow! Another bloom disintegrated in a burst of red. Not only were they powerful, they were extremely accurate. Neither of us could believe these were 25-cent Japanese slingshots. The entire hibiscus hedge was deflowered before we were called in to dinner. Within 30 minutes, our hurling devices had converted a blossomy red and green tropical hedgerow into just a hedge. Wednesday afternoon had been our moment of discovery, and the word quickly traveled across backyards and up and down the streets. The next Saturday, we were up at the crack of dawn. The crew had stirred with enthusiasm and pooled together all financial resources. With piggy banks raided and parents' pockets picked clean, a small wagon train of stingrays rode up Vista Lane and onto Red Road, headed straight for the Sunset 5 and 10. We didn't even pull off at the Parrot Jungle to buy Super Bubble bubblegum. the crew was on a mission to secure the entire inventory of Japanese slingshots. And we did. Red, green, and blue, we bought them all. The old gent who owned the place was all smiles and had an extra hop in his step as he moved around the cash register. We headed out the front door and mounted our bikes. Within a couple of hours, we were back in the neighborhood, pockets filled with gravel, roaming the area looking for suitable targets. They were abundant, from glass bottles to tin cans to street signs to mockingbirds. We had plenty of things to shoot at. Our proficiency quickly rose to a high level. These cheap little devices became our standard bearers of defense and aggressive assault. Regardless of where our crew went, there was likely one sticking out of the back pocket of a pair of dungarees or swinging from a chrome angel wing handlebar. About that time, Dad's stake charmer invention had taken off. In a frenzy to meet demand, he and his partner were ordering parts by the gross. They would arrive on ships from Japan in 2-foot square wooden crates. Manufacturers had not gotten around to inventing corrugated cardboard for packing and shipping, so the crates were made of wood and stuffed with wood chips. My dad's shop had stacks of small crates full of parts. One day Lobster, tired, I presume, of using crude pieces of white gravel in his 25-cent slingshot, was roving around in the shop and came upon a small crate chock full of polished, threaded fasteners. They were the female ends used to secure the stake charmer handles together. He scooped up a handful and headed out into the backyard. He loaded one into the little leather pouch, pinched, drew back, aimed, and released. The fastener shot like a bullet and whistled the whole way until it found its mark, dead center, in the weather vane my dad had installed on the top of our roof. It was a silhouette of 3 owls, and the hard chromium fastener made a loud ping and a significant dent in the father owl's breast. The vane spun lazily in response, suggesting a light breeze from the west, though there was actually a moderate breeze from the south. If Dad had been in the kitchen at that moment, monitoring his built-in wind speed and directional indicator gauges, most certainly an eyebrow would have been raised. Not only did we all now have highly effective slingshots, Lobster had uncovered an entire crate of superior Japanese whistling ammo as well. We had come a long way from a clunky wooden whammo slingshot, gravel, and busted thumbs, and Dad had a new puzzle to solve, with an injured wind vane and an out-of-whack parts inventory. Our small world changed overnight. With a crack group of well-armed boys on the prowl, all things could become a target. Little was safe. However, we were discriminating and had some general guidelines. If it was expensive and owned by a parent, it was off limits. Windows were off limits. Pets were off limits. Members of the crew were off limits. Bufo mariners were also off limits, as their tough, leathery skin just wasted our premium ammunition. Land crabs were not off limits. It may have been our imagination, but it seemed that within a few weeks of buying out the Sunset 5 and 10's Japanese slingshot inventory for the tidy sum of $2.83, our neighborhood grew unusually quiet. It would appear that most of the bird and small animal life had headed for deep cover. Where had all the squawking blue jays gone? Why no mockingbirds? Squirrels were absent. The cardinals were missing as well. They were all a lot smarter than we had presumed. We concluded that if we were to hunt, we would need to explore a more fruitful and well-populated region. We needed more targets. Soon, we discovered that place, 1 mile east, right across Old Cutler Road on Biscayne Bay. The common South Florida land crab is like many other terrestrial crabs the world over. They live underground by digging holes with their claws in muddy soil near water. They will creep up and out of their burrows when the coast is clear and mess around, without straying too far, foraging for tidbits of food. As soon as they feel threatened, they scoot rapidly back down into their holes. I guess they were as close as we could get in South Florida to the prairie dog, but no fur and more legs. Like many other infestations we endured, we also were beset with a land crab problem that seemed to suddenly exist when, shortly before, they were nowhere to be found. Years later, it became apparent that the convulsive ecological shock that was delivered upon the state of Florida in the 1950s was unsettling to countless species, including land crabs. As the mangroves were scraped away for new building lots, the land crab population had to pick up stakes and move on to another tract of muddy ground, and soon they would have to do so again. In this regard, it would appear that the small round-shelled critters, with periscope eyes and mismatched pincher claws, had it no better than the American Indians a few hundred years earlier. Land crabs were aggressive and very well armed. Whenever they felt threatened, they would rise up and wave their claws in fair warning. One claw was always considerably larger than the other and could be positively huge. It was not uncommon for us to come upon a mature adult crab with a 10-inch pincher. More than once, Monkey or Jungle got a bit too close and ended up with one securely attached to a finger or bare toe. Once in the pincher's grip, letting go was an unlikely outcome. Like a gator, when they clamped down, they were serious and had no intention of releasing their catch. They would rather die. The good news is that, unlike an alligator's jaws, a land crab's claws seemed to be only meagerly affixed to its body, so they would break away with little more than a twist or two. Kind of like bindings releasing a snow ski. If the going got tough, better to jettison the ski than blow out the knee. On occasion, a crab would quickly depart a small altercation with one less claw, and didn't seem all that upset about it. We understood that a new claw would grow to replace the one left behind, but this may have been more speculation than fact, as we were never able to keep track of a crab thus afflicted. The land crab was also mobile. Once a year, they migrated back to the bay to lay millions of eggs. We would occasionally, by random luck of timing, come upon a migration. It was a sight indeed. Thousands of the tropical, multicolored crabs would surge up out of their holes like a rising tide and clatter and click down the streets near the water headed for Biscayne Bay. It was a pearlescent blanket of rippling pink and blue and orange. Though they probably did not know why, they nonetheless made their pilgrimage year after year. Facing Old Cutler Road was a very old house that existed well before the Gables by the Sea development was a glimmer in some ambitious developer's eye. The nondescript house was buried in overgrown shrubs in front and sat on a 2-acre lot that dropped away from Old Cutler and into the new development. For all we knew, this was the developer's own homestead. Then again, perhaps the resident of the ratty property owned and in turn had sold the mangrove swamp to the developer in the first place. All was conjecture. The house was derelict. We never saw a single human anywhere on the property, and it had an immense infestation of land crabs. A massive banyan tree was sprawled all the way down at the end of the sloping yard and unfurled its mighty branches above hundreds of land crab holes. Time and again, we'd jump on our bikes with slingshots in back pockets or hanging from handlebars, pockets stuffed with pilfered, polished fasteners, and head down the road to hunt land crabs. As we approached the ground, beneath the huge banyan, a couple of hundred crabs would be peeking out of their holes or, better yet, crouching completely outside of them. We would dismount, drop our bikes to the ground, and load our slings. The crabs would rear up and wave their claws as they skittered sideways, taking their stand on their muddy piece of turf, as if egging us on. As we aimed and drew back, they would disappear into their holes. They would taunt, we would fire. Our polished fasteners would whistle through the air and mostly miss, but occasionally we would score. Whether by luck or a mistimed dodge by a distracted crab, we would take one out. There would be a pop and a crack as the ammo hit home, and the crab would disappear into its muddy hole for eternity. It is not clear if our hunting of the South Florida land crab had a meaningful impact on their eventual disappearance from the area. With thousands on the loose, maybe we landed a dozen. Given the few we actually hit, I suspect there were larger forces at work in the diminishment of the land crab population. Yes, they eventually disappeared. Our shooting gallery was abandoned. But for certain, no longer did I have to endure the clicking sounds of crabs scuttling across my dark garage floor late at night, or the occasion on a Saturday morning when I was greeted on my front stoop, wearing only bare feet, by an upraised 10-inch pincher. Let's just say that some people can be a bit self-absorbed, offering scant consideration of their neighbors. The next tale is one way that a couple of young boys use knowledge and creativity to deal with such distasteful behavior. It's Chapter 7, and it's called Inconvenient Shrub.